5 months pregnant and left standing in the snow, she heard only one thing from the man who promised to marry her. "That's not my child." She didn't cry, just walked into the woods and collapsed by a frozen river, whispering, "I just wanted to be loved." But what happened next will shock even those who think they've seen it all. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The sky hung low over the prairie, streaked with pale orange and bruised violet as the sun dropped behind the ridgeline. The light touched the snowdrifts with fleeting grace, but offered no warmth. Martha sat at the edge of the wagon bench, her back stiff with resolve, though the muscles beneath her dress twitched from strain. Her fingers, raw and pink at the tips, gripped the reins as though they were the last cords tethering her to the world she had left behind. Her eyes scanned the horizon endlessly, seeking more than direction. She was looking for a sign, not from God necessarily, but from something older, quieter, more personal. A reason to believe this journey had not been foolish. In the breast pocket of her wool coat, the letter crinkled with every breath. She had read it so many times the ink was beginning to smudge at the edges. The folds were soft now, worn thin by fingertips desperate for reassurance. "You need a man to protect you." The line rang in her head, both promise and chain. Back in St. Helena, they had whispered, not cruelly, but with that pitying softness that felt like poison under a veil of sympathy. Poor Martha, carrying all that grief, and now this. As though grief were a disease that might infect others if she stayed too long. The wagon wheel thudded into a rut, jolting her body with a sharpness that reached her ribs. The child within her stirred, a slow, gentle roll, and she placed a hand over the swell of her belly. "Not long now," she murmured, unsure if she meant the journey or the birth, or perhaps the reckoning. The cold seeped through her boots and her spine, but it could not touch that fire in her chest, that stubborn ember of hope she refused to let die. Walter's letter was more than an invitation. It was a reprieve, a possibility, however fragile, that she might still have a place in this hardening world. She had gambled everything, her savings, her health, her dignity, on the belief that someone, somewhere, might want all of her. So when she saw his figure emerge between the distant pines, upright in the saddle, coat brushing the sides of his horse like a flag, her heart did not falter. She adjusted her bonnet, straightened her back, and smiled, not out of vanity, but in defiance of every voice that had told her she was no longer worth the trouble. She had come too far to be sent away now. The forest pressed in like a cathedral of silence, branches heavy with snow, the air so still it seemed to swallow sound. Martha's breath came in shallow bursts, white clouds fading into nothingness. Each step was a negotiation between instinct and surrender. Her skirts clung to her legs, sodden with melted snow and dusted with frost. Her fingers, numb and cracked, curled inward as though ashamed of their own helplessness. She had no destination, only motion. A haunted inertia that carried her deeper into the woods, away from the echo of Walter's boots and the hollow space his words had left inside her. The snow came faster now, not in gentle flakes, but in sheets that blurred the trees into watercolor ghosts. She pressed a hand to her side where the ache had settled, low and sharp, and realized, with a flicker of panic, how cold her skin had become. Her body felt distant, like something she used to inhabit. Her child stirred once more, faint, as if asking if there would be warmth again. She collapsed near the river, knees buckling without grace. The frozen bank was unforgiving, biting into her limbs with indifference. Her head lolled to one side, eyes catching the jagged dance of ice along the water's edge. It was beautiful in the way death sometimes is. Quiet, unfeeling, vast. "I just wanted to be loved," she whispered, the words unraveling into the wind like threads from a worn shawl. They were not an accusation, only a truth too soft for the world she had been cast from. And then, a shift in the air. A shadow moved between the pines, deliberate and soundless. Elijah saw her before she saw him. He had watched deer die less slowly than this. Proud creatures who had limped away from injury until the forest humbled them. But this was no doe. This was a woman, still breathing though every force around her urged otherwise. He felt no triumph in finding her, only gravity. He knelt beside her with hands practiced in reverence, not for what she was, but for the miracle that she was still alive. Gently, he laid his coat over her shoulders, wrapping the edges with a shawl of fox fur, then lifted her into his arms. She weighed little, less than she should. Yet something in her presence, even unconscious, felt immense. Elijah didn't speak. The forest didn't require words. He carried her through the trees, the snow falling between them like a hush. A vow, perhaps, that her suffering had been seen, and would not continue unanswered. The days passed like snowmelt over stone, slow, quiet, and steady. In the hush of Elijah's cabin, time did not push, it allowed. The walls were rough-hewn logs, sealed with clay and lined with fur pelts where winter crept through. The hearth burned low most nights, just enough to warm the bones and keep the silence company. No ticking clocks, no anxious footsteps above. Only the rhythm of life pared down to its barest truth. Martha moved through this space like someone relearning her own shape. At first, she flinched at every kindness, soup left beside her bedside, a fresh stack of wood by the door, boots dried and waiting. She did not know how to accept a world that asked nothing in return. Her days began early. Before dawn, she swept the hearth, tied her hair with string, and worked with a quiet diligence born not of obligation, but of wanting to give something back to the man who had not asked for anything. She stitched the hem of his coat one morning by firelight, fingers tracing old seams where time had frayed them. She found his shirts too coarse and so traded a bundle of dried herbs in the village for a softer thread. Word had already spread. Of course it had. Martha felt it in the wary glances at the trading post, the way conversation dropped when she entered. A white woman, visibly pregnant, living with a Shawnee man. Some called her lost, others called her worse, but Elijah's silence was her shield. He never asked where she came from, never asked who the father was. He asked only if she was warm enough, if she'd eaten. When her hands shook while skinning her first rabbit, he said nothing, just placed his fingers gently over hers and guided them, steady and slow. At dusk, they sometimes sat on the step outside the cabin, where the pines thinned and the sky opened wide. She would speak of her mother's hymns, of her husband's silence, of the strange ache that came not from pain, but the absence of anyone to witness her. Elijah listened with the patience of stone. His replies were few, but they held weight. When she spoke of shame, he said only, "Shame belongs to those who gave it to you." He handed her the shawl on a night when the wind moaned like an old prayer through the trees, made from rabbit and fox, its edges hand-stitched with small, deliberate care. "For the child," he said, holding her gaze. "And for the mother." Her throat caught. Not because the gift was beautiful, though it was, but because it had been made not to fix her or claim her, but to honor her. And in that moment, with pine smoke rising behind them and her belly rising before her, Martha did not feel broken. She felt seen. The river cracked and sang with thaw as the last snows melted into soft earth, and the world breathed again. Shoots of green pierced through the frost-bitten soil like quiet proclamations of survival. Inside the cabin, light filtered through the window in golden streaks, catching on dust motes that danced above the cradle. Martha leaned over it, her fingers brushing the downy cheek of the child who had come into the world with a cry that sounded, to her ears, like defiance. A wail that declared, "I am here." She named her Grace, not in irony, but in reverence. For all she had lost, for all she had endured, this child was the unburned center of her hope. In her eyes, wide and dark like her father's, Martha saw the echo of Elijah's quiet strength, not by blood, but by presence. Every breath Grace took was tethered to the firelight, the stew pots, the split logs, the hands that had held Martha through the long, cold passage between rejection and rebirth. The village that once turned its face began, slowly, to show another. The woman with the crooked teeth who had once crossed the road to avoid her now left a loaf of bread wrapped in muslin at her doorstep. A hunched elder offered wool scraps for swaddling. A child, too young to care for whispers, placed a wildflower beside the cradle and ran off giggling. The shift was not grand, but it was real. A recognition that dignity, once cast aside, had stood back up and held a child to its chest. It was on a market day, when the dirt paths had turned to mud and the sun finally warmed the skin, that Walter appeared again. He rode in on a sorrel gelding, head high, but the moment his eyes found Martha among the stalls, his reins slackened. She stood by a table of seed packets, Grace cradled against her chest in a shawl stitched with fox fur. Her hands were bare, no ring, but there was nothing empty in her. Elijah was beside her, one palm resting lightly against the small of her back, a subtle gesture more intimate than any proclamation. Walter stared, not at her, but at what he had dismissed, rejected, failed to see. His mouth moved, but no words came. And then he looked away, fast, as if to outrun what shame had finally caught him. That evening, as the frogs began their song in the creek beds and the trees rustled with new life, Martha folded linens in the golden hush of twilight. "I should thank you," she said, her voice low, steady, "for saving my life." Elijah did not stop stacking firewood. "You saved your own," he answered. "I only gave you shelter to remember how." Beneath the dogwood tree weeks later, its blossoms falling like a gentle hush over the grass, they stood with Grace between them. No preacher, no witness, only the wind and the scent of earth waking from winter. Elijah looked at her the way no one ever had, not for what she lacked, but for what she carried and refused to let die. "You are loved," he said, as simply as one might speak the truth. "You always were."